Hilchos Shar Avos Hatumos Perek Shneim Asar, the laws of the remaining sources, primary sources of impurity, chapter 12. We are deep in to the rabbinic elements of impurity. And today, we're going to be discussing, it's kind of like going to take summary form. Today, the next day, and the day after that, where the Rambam is going to give us a bunch of lists in terms of impurity related to rabbinic decrees. Today we're going to get the list of the 11 ways that Kodesh is stricter than Truma. Sacrificial meat and related things are stricter than things related to Truma. Tomorrow it's going to be another list, 5, 6 things of this, then it's going to be another list of 11 doubts, different doubts and how we deal with doubts. So it's a bunch of different lists. Now, some of the things we learned, we're going to have today, we already learned. Just now it goes into the list, so it kind of becomes part of that. Other things will actually be new information. But the theme is it's always going to be what makes Kodesh stricter than Truma. So the Rambam says, Halacha Aleph, Achas Esrei Mailis Asu Chachamim La Kodesh Ala Truma. 11 Mailis. Mailis means literally steps, but in this context it means stringencies. The sages made 11 stringencies with regards to treating sacrificial related things over Truma. Ve'eluhain, and they are the following. Now, it's not clear. The Rambam doesn't number them. Typically he will do that. He will write number 1, number 2. So as we're going to see, some of them are just one case, some of them are multiple cases, all under the same umbrella, as the commentaries explain the Rambam here. Number 1, Yesh la'adam lahatbil kelim b'seich kelim litruma avalei l'kodesh. A person can immerse in a mikvah utensils inside of other utensils if he's doing so for truma, not for kodesh. What does this mean? Tomorrow we're going to see more about this. You can't just decide to use a utensil for something higher in holiness. If you were using a utensil for regular food, and you want to now start using it for truma, you have to put it in the mikveh again, and purposely have in mind, now I want to make it pure enough for truma. You raise the purity level. Then you want to rise it to kodesh, you got to dip it in the mikveh again. So the Rambam over here is saying, when a person is immersing utensils for truma use, he can pile in utensils inside of utensils. You could put a smaller bowl into a bigger bowl, and dip all 3 at once. But for Kodesh, you can't do that. Why can't you do it for Kodesh? Gzeira, it's a decree. Shembo yiyeh pia klitzar. Maybe what's going to happen is you're going to put a utensil, it has a very narrow entrance, and inside of it you're going to put another utensil, but because there's a narrow entrance, v'lo yiyeh bo kishfoiferes hanoid. Maybe it's not going to be big enough of what's called the shveiferes hanoid. I guess the best way to translate that is the spout of a flask. This was very common in those days. They had a flask, and the flasks were very flexible.
Made of leather.
Yeah, they weren't stable so much. So how do you pour out?
Solid.
It wasn't solid, exactly. How do you pour out the liquid from a flask? So they would have this shveiferes, this little spout that would attach to the top, and that would kind of be used as like a funnel of sorts to direct the fluids. So in halacha they use this concept, shveiferes hanoid, to describe the size of different holes. Even in a mikveh actually itself, when we talk about the hole between the rainwater and any other water that you add, has to be a shveiferes hanoid. Anyways, so the point is, if the mouth of the outer utensil is not big enough to accommodate this shveiferes hanoid, the nimtzu hakelim shebeseichai keilu tavlu b'mayim shebakli. So when you put it in the mikveh, it's going to look like the utensils that are inside that narrow mouth were actually immersed, not in a mikveh, but in the water that collected inside that utensil. Leiba mikveh,
But who would put
not in the
something
mikveh.
there?
Huh?
What would you put in the
You're trying to dip a bunch of things in a mikveh at once.
Like
Yeah. So you have a little narrow, so you stick in a bunch of little forks and spoons and knives, right? Like this,
glass,
in a glass, right? But more of a glass that kind of tapers off to a small top, like a champagne glass maybe. And then you say, I'll just dip it all together.
Right.
And
Fill it up with the water,
you end
dip
up
it in and-
you end up having a scenario, where it looks like it's a decree. It's not a biblical concept. It's a rabbinic decree that it might look like it. So therefore, you stay away from it. For truma, you can do that, but for kodesh, not.
Interesting.
Meaning you can't do anything, even in this case where there's 2 bowls and they're not problematic, for sure not. But if it's for kodesh, you stay away from it. Says the Rambam, when do we say you shouldn't do this? If the outer utensil, which is being immersed, holding the smaller utensils, the outer one has to be pure. But if the outer one is also impure, which means you're also immersing that one simply to get out of impurity. So then, since the immersion is helping for it, because it's impure now becoming pure, also like kelim shebeseichai. So we're actually going to allow it to count for the utensils inside of it, afilu lehishtamesh b'hen b'kodesh, even for kodesh. So when the outer utensil is pure, then don't use it. Impure, it's fine. Okay, that's number one. Number two, kli halacha beis. Kli shenitmu achayra b'mashkin. If you have a utensil whose outside became impure through liquid. This was a decree we learned the other day, that if you have liquid which became impure, even if they touch the outside of a utensil, they make it impure. However, loy nitma toichay, v'loy beis etzba sheba oivis fasav, it only makes literal outside impure. Nothing in the inside becomes impure, and also not what's called the finger area. The finger area was a typical, they used to have like this. You know, today when you get a box, they have these little holes in the side of the box to allow your hands to come inside. So they used to actually make them, these little inserts into the jugs to kind of, like grip, yeah, to carry. So that, even though technically it's on the outside, some say it's actually more in the rim. Like it was up here, you know, so it wasn't actually on the outside. But the point is that it stays pure. The hamashkin shebeseichai, oishe bebeis tzviyasai tohayden. Any liquid which collects inside the jug, or even if somehow liquid collected in this little insert, it would be pure. V'sheisaboy, and you could drink from it. And you don't have to worry, maybe your lips, when you drink from it, are going to touch the outside of the utensil. And then the liquid in your mouth is going to make the vessel impure. But, where's the stringency here? When do we say this leniency? When it comes to truma. But with regards to sacrificial meat, once the back outside of a utensil becomes impure, the whole thing becomes impure. So here's an example of a law that we actually already learned. Now that I'm just putting it into the list of the 11 things. Halacha Gimel. Hanoisei es hamidras. Midras means something which was lied down on or sat on, became impure through a zav. So maybe a bowl is not the best example. Think of just like a mat or something, okay? So he's carrying a utensil which became impure through medras. Mutar lo lisa imay truma ke'echad. When it comes to truma, you can carry it in the other hand at the same time. Or as the commentaries even add, they can both be on the same board. You can be carrying a long board. On one side is literally an impure utensil, on the other side is truma. Even though technically when you're carrying midras, you become impure, and the truma is literally right next to it, doesn't make a difference. As long as the person carrying is not touching the truma, nor is the truma touching the midras, it's pure. Okay, so this picture is a little bit inaccurate because here he's actually touching the truma. It should better be a board, on a board. So there's no direct contact between him and the truma and the midras. Again, where's the stringency? You shouldn't be carrying kodesh, sacrificial stuff, on the same board, even though you're not touching it. And the reason for this is because of a story. The Rambam says, there was a story where a person was carrying a barrel, wine, that was kodesh. It was put away for libations, for nesachim, so it becomes holy. And he was doing the same thing. He was carrying a board. He was keeping distance, but something happened. He slipped, he tripped, and the midrash touched the kodesh, making the kodesh impure. At that moment, the sages decreed, if you're carrying midras, no carrying kodesh with it. And because that was the story, they only decreed on the story. This is classic of the rabbis. We're not going to make, just because some mess up happened, we're not going to now decree on everything. In the case of the mess up, we're going to make a decree to stop from that happening again. So only kodesh became forbidden, but not truma. If a person transgresses this decree and he still carries midras with kodesh, if you avoid it, if they don't touch each other, then good for you, lucky you, it stays pure. But ideally, you shouldn't do that. That's number 3. Number 4, stringency. Halacha dalet, bigdei oichlei truma. The clothing of those who eat truma, kohanim. Now, of course, kohanim have to keep their clothes in a state of purity, so that they avoid getting impure with truma. So a person who eats truma, his clothes are held to a pretty high standard. Nevertheless, even though they're pure, and the people wearing them are being very careful not to become impure, relative to somebody who wants to eat sacrificial meat, he needs to treat his clothes as literally impure. And we'll see more about this tomorrow. The higher up you are in the hierarchy of eating holier foods, you treat those lower than you as impure just to avoid getting into any problems. This is the fourth stringency of Kodesh over Truma. Halacha Hey, the fifth stringency, Kli shehu mefutzal. Let's say you have a utensil which could come apart. Just imagine today we have to deal with this. Imagine we have to do this. This is like, if anything in your house became impure, if you want to reuse it has to go to the mikveh. Your dining room table could become impure. Start schlepping your table to the mikveh. This was part of daily life in those days. So the Rambam is talking about, this is what we say every day after davening, hit bilbay samita, you're dipping a bed. So imagine there was a utensil that has multiple parts. That's what mefutzal means. Mefutzal means it's assembled from parts, yeah? V'luchaisav v'kreisav nekusharis. But it happens to be right now that the boards and the beams are attached. Like a bed. Okay, so we're going to use this ancient bed, made up of different pieces, but right now it's all attached. Im nitma, says the Rambam, if it became impure, v'tzarich lahat bila litruma, and you want to put it in the mikveh, but only with intent for truma, you want kohanim to be able to sit on this and eat truma. You're allowed to dip it all as it is tied up, all attached, assembled. But if you're going to dip this now to have sacrificial meat, touching it on, stored on it or eaten on it, matir umenagev, you need to undo all the knots and dip or immerse it part by part, and then you dry it. Because maybe there's some intervening substance, and only then then you can immerse it and then you tie it back. This is the fifth stringency of kodesh over truma. Only for kodesh you got to take it apart, not for truma. Halacha vav, number 6, the sixth stringency. Kelim hanigmarim betara, utensils that were completed in purity, meaning pottery utensils typically, the final stage is firing them in a kiln, right? So, right after that, they become a utensil, and right after that, they become considered a kli, halachic utensil, and they're now susceptible to becoming impure. So, what if a person, as soon as they finished, he's watching them, being careful that they should not become impure. Even if it was a real Torah sage, and he's being very careful. If they want to be used for sacrificial meat, they must be taken to the mikveh. Think about it. You have your eyes on it the whole time. You didn't lose sight of it. Doesn't make a difference. For kodesh, first immersion is required. No need for waiting for sun, so like a typical immersion, but they have to have an immersion. Avoli truma. Here's the contrast. For truma, mishtamish ben b'lei tvila. You can use them without going to the mikveh. Shahari nasu b'tarda, because they were clearly made in purity, and you're watching them. So why then? What's the reasoning behind the stringency to require immersion for kodesh? Gazru, the sages made a decree, because maybe during the work, the final stage of the process, an am haaretz will come by, and his saliva will end up on one of the utensils, and it will stay moist, the saliva, until after the utensils are finished being processed, which would make a rabbinic impurity from the am haaretz. Therefore, the rabbi said, for kodesh, always go to the mikveh. Halacha Zayin, this is the seventh one, and the seventh one we're actually going to have a couple of cases. Till now, it was one halacha per stringency. For number 7, we're going to get a couple of halachas. Hakli mitzaref, mashe b'soiche lekodesh, avalei letruma. If you have a bunch of distinct entities inside of a utensil, the utensil combines them all with regards to sacrificial meat or sacrificial things, but not with regards to truma. And what does that mean? Ketzat. Klishu umale peres prudin, zemizeh. Say, for example, you have a utensil that's full of a bunch of different fruits that are separate from each other. It could go in simukin ugregris. Like, I picked the example here, raisins. Or dried figs. They're all sitting in a pile. V'naga tuma be'echad mehem, comes a source of impurity and touches one raisin. Nitma kol shebakli lekodesh. So everything in the utensil, all the raisins here, all the figs here, become impure with regards to kodesh. Now kodesh, we saw yesterday, means things that are actually holy, what's called kedushas haguf. Holy, their body is holy. When do you use raisins in the context of Okay, they are grapes, but when is a raisin itself used for kodesh? So there's a couple of opinions here in the commentaries. One says that here we're not talking about the classic kodesh. We're talking about what's called kedushas damim, even if it's holy just for its worth. So like this could be bikurim, maybe it's first fruits, that kind of a thing. So it will not meet the typical definition of kodesh, but for this concept, it's a different type of kodesh. Or there's other commentaries that say that not that the raisins themselves are kodesh, but that with regards to kodesh, in other words, if sacrificial meat will now touch one of these raisins, it's going to become impure because the utensil made them all impure. There's even another interpretation where he's planning to eat these raisins with kodesh. He likes raisins with meat. So he has a korban. Is it a common thing? Okay. So you give a little. What about figs? Same thing.
Yeah, you could definitely.
Okay. So he has some meat. He has some korban meat, and he wants to eat it with these things. So with regards to that, they have the din of kodesh. Anyway, a number of different approaches. The point is that even though the tuma only touched one of the raisins, one of the figs, because it's all in the same utensil, so it's all becoming combined. Truma, not for truma. If the raisins or the figs are truma raisins or figs, touching one doesn't affect the others. Says the Rambam, you should know, before we go further, the chol hamayla shel divrei enhein, all of the stringencies that we mentioned in this chapter are all rabbinic. V'remez yesh l'mayla zu b'Torah. But this one is special that it has a hint in the Torah. And where's the hint? A verse that we say multiple times a year. It's part of the Chanukah Torah reading before Pesach when we do the Nasi every day. It's there. And by Parshas Nasi when we read it, it says, Kaf achas asara zahav malei ketairas. 1 spoon, it weighed 10 gold shekel, it was full of ketairas. What's ketairas? Incense. Incense is powder. Every particle is separate. Said the sages, Amru Chachamim, Kol Masha Bakaf Hareo Keguf Echad. Torah says Kaf Achas, meaning whatever is in the spoon becomes like one entity with regards to impurity. So here you see that the utensil combines everything in the Torah. Afilu Kli She'ein Le'toich. Even a utensil that has no inside, no receptacle, like the board. Mitzaref Masha Allah l'Kodesh. We'll combine whatever's on it with regards to Kodesh. Kegoin Shahayu Tzvurin al Gabe Haluach. Let's say the figs were piled on top of a board. Or al Gabe Ha'or, on a piece of leather. This is fascinating. Even if they're not touching each other. In this picture, they're all touching. What if I had a fig over here and a fig over there? If the tumah touches this fig, it's considered to be in one utensil and it transfers to the other fig as well.
One unit.
It's literally one unit.
Even if it's spaced out.
Even if it's spaced. You had 2 piles in a utensil, and something else is in between them. All right, so let's just call it raisins on the side, flour in the middle. Just pick the example. And one of the piles becomes impure on the sides. If the middle thing required a utensil, that means you can't just carry it, like flour. I mean, there's particles. So then, the utensil combines them and everything is impure. If the middle thing wouldn't require a utensil, so then we can consider the middle entity as an intervening substance, doesn't need the utensil, and only the pile on one side becomes impure, but not the other one. Let us assume there was 2 piles in one utensil. One side, one pile is touching some water outside of the utensil. And a person who is impure is touching the other pile. So the way the commentators explain it is like this. No water entered the utensil. The first pile is just raised above. It's piled over the rim of the utensil, it's touching some water. And this guy is impure, touching the other pile. So not only does both of the piles become impure because they're combined in the utensil, the water outside the utensil also becomes impure because of the food which is touching it, even though they're outside the utensil completely. They're not even inside. That's how far the tumah will spread. It spreads from this pile to that pile, and from here to the water as well. Naga hatame b'mayim sha'acheri akli. What if it was the opposite? It's the tame guy is touching not the pile, touching this guy, the water. Nitma ha'eichal ha'mechur b'lehem. So definitely the flour that's touching it becomes impure. V'hadavar safek im nitma ha'eichal ha'sheni b'tziruf akli or le nitma machmas hatziruf. Here we don't know if the utensil makes them combined. Because you can say it makes them combined if an actual source of impurity touches it. Here, it touched a liquid, which touched the food, so now we're not sure you take it that far. Halacha yud. Oichel kodesh shenitma, v'hinichai bekli. Here, you have a piece of meat, sacrificial meat became impure outside of the utensil. You come and you put it into the utensil. Oichel kodesh acher toher. Next to it is another piece of meat, but this one's pure. So you put an impure piece of meat next to a pure one, not touching. They're not touching each other. Each one remains in its original state. Because the law of the combination of the utensil only works if they were both in the utensil, and that's when Tumah touched one of them. But if it came in impure, then that's it. It stays, its impurity doesn't spread to anything else. If now a person who went to the mikvah, was waiting for sunset, came and touched the impure piece, now, this is a new level of impurity being imposed. Maybe this new level of impurity causes that the new impurity should spread to the pure piece. And that's a doubt. Right? Because of the combination of the utensil. Maybe it doesn't become disqualified because the tefillin is only touching a piece of meat that already is satiated with impurity. It's already impure, meaning, and he didn't add anything to it. So that's the two ways to look at it. Did he add a new qualitative tumah or not? And that would decide if the utensil would combine them or not. Anyway, that's all for number 7. Halacha Yud Aleph, number 8. The 8th stringency. This was the topic of yesterday's chapter. Haravi b'kodesh pasul avol b'truma tahar. 4th level kodesh could become disqualified, not truma. V'chein hashlishi shebetruma, also part of yesterday's thing. If you have a truma which is a shlishi, 4th degree, im naga b'mashke kodesh harei nitma. If it touches liquid that's sacrificial, it makes it impure. Kamesha b'yarnu, as we explained. V'hashlishi shebetruma isha b'kodesh im naga b'mashke truma lei pasle. Whereas 3rd degree truma or even 3rd degree kodesh, if it would touch another liquid of truma, it will not make it into a 4th degree because there's no such thing as revi when it comes to truma. Halacha Yud Bey is number 9. We also had this before. Misha nitmeis yadei achas v'naga ba b'yadei shniya. A person's right hand becomes impure, and he touches his left hand. Oy b'yad chaveira, or his friend's hand. Pasal lesashniya v'harehi kishlishi. He makes the second hand impure like a shlishi, because the hand is sheni, so it imposes shlishi level. If your first hand was moist with water, even if you didn't touch the other hand becomes impure. And you must dip them both in a mikvah before you can touch kodesh. That's all for kodesh though. The bottom line here. But for truma, if one hand becomes impure, the other one is not impure, even if you touch it when it's dry. And plus, no need to put it in the mikveh, the one that became impure. You simply wash it until yadayim, and you're good. So this is what we had in chapter 8. Same thing that Rambam is repeating it over here. Truma, hand to hand does not go. Chodesh, it does. Halacha Yud Gimel, number 10. You have some dry food that never became susceptible to impurity through contact with liquid. You can eat them with impure hands. That's only if they're truma. But if it's kodesh meat, what's called chibas hakodesh machshartan, the cherishment, the love for kodesh, considers them to be susceptible. So I made him hugging the meat because he loves the kodesh. He loves it. But it makes it mukhshar, it makes it vulnerable to tumah without liquid. That's the stringency. You cannot eat, if your hands are impure, you cannot eat kodesh, even if you don't touch it by hand, only with a fork or whatever. You put a skewer into it. Or your friend sticks it into your mouth. It's all impure, it's all forbidden as a way to avoid eating it directly with your hands. By truma, This decree doesn't exist. Certainly, if actual impurity, not just your hands, touch kodesh food, which didn't become vulnerable through liquid, still shenitmu, they become impure because again, this love that we have for holy things makes it susceptible itself. When do we say this? That the food itself is disqualified, the kodesh itself. But to go and count from there 1, 2, and all the degrees, that's a doubt. What does that mean? Ketzad. If this food, the kodesh food, that became impure without becoming susceptible through liquid, touches another food that did become susceptible, now the second one is in doubt. Because the first one really shouldn't be impure, because it wasn't mukhshar. The only reason it's considered to be mukhshar is because of chibas HaKodesh. So we don't know if that carries all the way to making the hierarchy of 1, 2, 3, and 4, etc. And number 11, the final one. Ha'ainin, a person who is in deep mourning. That means relative passed away, hasn't even been buried yet. Achar shatamu yemei aninusai. After the day or the days of this deep mourning finish. Umechusar kipurim achar shehevi kaparasa. You're a person who has to bring a sacrifice to become fully pure. After they bring the sacrifice, tzrichin tvila la'achilas hakodesh. They have to go to the mikveh before they eat sacrificial meat. Avalele truma, but not for truma. Sha'ainu mechusar kipurim mutarin la'achalas truma. Because a person in deep mourning and a person who is waiting to bring a sacrifice could eat truma. Why do they have to have a mikveh for eating sacrificial meat? So the sages were stringent. Till now, while they were in their deep pain or in their state of impurity, they couldn't eat sacrificial meat. Which means that they weren't paying attention. Maybe they became impure without knowing. Now, the Rambam clarifies, this was only imposed for eating. For touching, they can touch. That's fine. There's no eating. But that's all if somebody already brought his sacrifice. But if you're actually before the sacrifice was brought, and then you touch the kodesh, then it's pasul. Then it's disqualified, as we explained, because while you're allowed to touch it after you bring the sacrifice, but not before you can eat or touch. Halacha Tezayin, now in summary, says the Rambam, Sheish Mailas Harishainus, the first 6 decrees we learned about today, also esan bein lekodesh, bein lechulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. They all apply, whether it's actual sacrificial meat or chulin that you're treating like sacrificial meat. So you also can't dip, one thing in the other. You also can't carry it together with kodesh. All that stuff we learned before. The chamesh ha'achreinos, but the last 5, shehein min hakli mitzaref mashe b'seiche v'hala, beginning with the case of the combination in the utensil, and further till the end of the chapter, asom b'kodesh bilvad avaloi b'chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. They only apply to actual sacrificial stuff, not to regular food being treated like kodesh. Elahareihin b'chamesh elu kechulin. In those 5 matters, they're like regular chulin. Lefikach, therefore, chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. If you have utensil, chulin that was being treated like kodesh, harishain tamei bahen, v'hasheni pasol, v'hashlishi toher kechulin. We don't go 1, 2, 3, 4 like kodesh. First is impure, second is pasul, it cannot go further, third is already pure, like chulin. As we explained, because chulin, al taras hakodesh, is basically considered chulin for most laws of impurity.